Chapter 10, Part B of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 10, Part B. The baron returned to Les Peuples about the middle of November. He seemed a different man, he had aged so much and was so low-spirited, he was fonder than ever of his daughter, as if the last few months of melancholy solitude had caused in him an imperative need of affection and tenderness. Jeanne told him nothing about her new ideas, her intimacy with the Abbé Tolbiac, or her religious enthusiasm, but the first time he saw the priest he felt an invincible dislike for him, and when his daughter asked him in the evening, "Well, what do you think of him?" "He is like an inquisitor," he answered. "He seems to me a very dangerous man." When the peasants told him about the young priest's harshness and bigotry, and the sort of war of persecution he waged against natural laws and instincts, his dislike changed to a violent hatred. He, the baron, belonged to the school of philosophers who worship nature. To him it seemed something touching when he saw two animals unite, and he was always ready to fall on his knees before the sort of pantheistic God he worshipped. But he hated the Catholic conception of a God who has petty schemes and gives way to tyrannical anger and indulges in mean revenge, a God, in fact, who seemed less to him than that boundless omnipotent nature which is at once life, light, earth, thought, plant, rock, man, air, animal, planet, god and insect, that nature which produces all things in such bountiful profusion, fitting each atom to the place it is to occupy in space, be that position close to or far from the suns which heat the worlds. Nature contained the germ of everything, and she brought forth life and thought, as trees bear flowers and fruit. To the baron, therefore, reproduction was a great law of nature, and to be respected as the sacred and divine act which accomplished the constant though unexpressed will of this universal being. And he at once began a campaign against this priest, who opposed the laws of creation. It grieved Jeanne to the heart, and she prayed to the Lord and implored her father not to run counter to the cure, but the baron always answered, "It is everyone's right and duty to fight against such men, for they are not like human creatures. They are not human," he repeated, shaking his long white hair. "They understand nothing of life, and their conduct is entirely influenced by their harmful dreams, which are contrary to nature," and he pronounced "contrary to nature" as if he were uttering a curse. The priest had at once recognised in him an enemy, and as he wished to remain master of the chateau and its young mistress, he temporised, feeling sure of victory in the end. By chance he had discovered the liaison between Julien and Gilberte, and his one idea was to break it off by no matter what means. He came to see Jeanne one day towards the end of the wet, mild winter, and after a long talk on the mystery of life, he asked her to unite with him in fighting against and destroying the wickedness which was in her own family, and so save two souls which were in danger. She asked him what he meant. "The hour has not come for me to reveal all to you," he replied, "but I will see you again soon," and with that he abruptly left her. He came again in a few days, and spoke in vague terms of a disgraceful connection between people whose conduct ought to be irreproachable. It was the duty, he said, of those who were aware of what was going on to use every means to put an end to it. He used all sorts of lofty arguments, and then, taking Jeanne's hand, adjured her to open her eyes, to understand and to help him. This time Jeanne saw what he meant, but terrified at the thought of all the trouble that might be brought to her home, which was now so peaceful, she pretended not to know to what he was alluding. Then he hesitated no longer, but spoke in terms there could be no misunderstanding. "I am going to perform a very painful duty, Madame la Comtesse, but I cannot leave it undone. The position I hold forbids me to leave you in ignorance of the sin you can prevent. Learn that your husband cherishes a criminal affection for Madame de Fourville." Jeanne only bent her head in feeble resignation.
What do you intend to do?" asked the priest.
"What do you wish me to do, Monsieur l'Abbé?" she murmured.
"Throw yourself in the way as an obstacle to this guilty love," he answered violently.
She began to cry, and said in a broken voice: "But he has deceived me before with a servant. He wouldn't listen to me. He doesn't love me now. He ill treats me if I manifest any desire that does not please him. So what can I do?" The cure did not make any direct answer to this appeal.
"Then you bow before this sin, you submit to it," he exclaimed. "You consent to and tolerate adultery under your own roof. The crime is being perpetrated before your eyes, and you refuse to see it. Are you a Christian woman? Are you a wife and a mother?"
"What would you have me do?" she sobbed.
"Anything rather than allow this sin to continue," he replied. "Anything, I tell you. Leave him. Flee from this house which has been defiled."
"But I have no money, Monsieur l'Abbé," she replied, "and I am not brave now like I used to be. Besides, how can I leave without any proofs of what you are saying? I have not the right to do so." The priest rose to his feet, quivering with indignation.
"You are listening to the dictates of your cowardice, madame. I thought you were a different woman, but you are unworthy of God's mercy."
She fell on her knees. "Oh, do not abandon me, I implore you. Advise me what to do."
"Open Monsieur de Fourville's eyes," he said shortly. "It is his duty to end this liaison."
She was seized with terror at this advice. "But he would kill them, Monsieur l'Abbé. And should I be the one to tell him? Oh, not that! Never, never!" He raised his hand as if to curse her, his whole soul stirred with anger.
"Live on in your shame and in your wickedness, for you are more guilty than they are. You are the wife who condones her husband's sin. My place is no longer here."
He turned to go, trembling all over with wrath. She followed him distractedly, ready to give in and beginning to compromise. But he would not listen to her and strode rapidly along, furiously shaking his big blue umbrella, which was nearly as high as himself. He saw Julien standing near the gate superintending the pruning of some trees, so he turned off to the left to reach the road by way of the Couillards' farm. And as he walked he kept saying to Jeanne: "Leave me, madame. I have nothing further to say to you." In the middle of the yard and right in his path some children were standing around the kennel of the dog Mirza, their attention concentrated on something which the baron was also carefully considering as he stood in their midst with his hands behind his back, looking like a schoolmaster. "Do come and see me again, Monsieur l'Abbé," pleaded Jeanne. "If you will return in a few days, I shall be able to tell you then what I think is the best course to take, and we can talk it over." By that time they had almost reached the group of children, which the baron had left to avoid meeting and speaking to his enemy the priest, and the cure went to see what it was that was interesting them so deeply. It was the dog whelping. 5 little pups were already crawling round the mother, who gently licked them as she lay on her side before the kennel, and just as the cure looked over the children's heads, a 6th appeared. When they saw it, all the boys and girls clapped their hands, crying: "There's another! There's another!" To them it was simply a perfectly pure and natural amusement, and they watched these pups being born as they might have watched the apples falling from a tree. The Abbé Tolbiac stood still for a moment in horrified surprise, then, giving way to his passion, he raised his umbrella and began to rain down blows on the children's heads. The startled urchins ran off as fast as they could go, and the Abbé found himself left alone with the dog, which was painfully trying to rise. Before she could stand up, he knocked her back again and began to hit her with all his strength. The animal moaned pitifully as she writhed under these blows from which there was no escape, for she was chained up, and at last the priest's umbrella broke. Then, unable to beat the dog any more, he jumped on her and stamped and crushed her under foot in a perfect frenzy of anger. Another pup was born beneath his feet before he dispatched the mother with a last furious kick, and then the mangled body lay quivering in the midst of the whining pups, which were awkwardly groping for their mother's teats. Jeanne had escaped, but the baron returned, and, almost as enraged as the priest, suddenly seized the abbé by the throat, and giving him a blow which knocked his hat off, carried him to the fence and threw him out into the road. When he turned round, M. Le Pertuis saw his daughter kneeling in the midst of the pups, sobbing as she picked them up and put them in her skirt. He strode up to her, gesticulating wildly. "There," he exclaimed, "what do you think of that surpliced wretch now?" The noise had brought the farm people to the spot, and they all stood round gazing at the remains of the dog. "Could one have believed that a man could be so cruel as that?" said Couillard's wife. Jeanne picked up the pups, saying she would bring them up by hand. She tried to give them some milk, but 3 out of 7 died the next day. Then old Simon went all over the neighbourhood trying to find a foster mother for the others. He could not get a dog, but he brought back a cat, asserting that she would do as well. 3 more pups were killed, and the 7th was given to the cat, who took to it directly, and lay down on her side to suckle it. That it might not exhaust its foster mother, the pup was weaned a fortnight later, and Jeanne undertook to feed it herself with a feeding bottle. She had named it Toto, but the baron rechristened it and called it Massacre. The priest did not go to see Jeanne again. The next Sunday he hurled curses and threats against the chateau, denouncing it as a plague spot which ought to be removed, and going on to anathematise the baron, who laughed at him, and to make veiled, half timid allusions to Julien's latest amour. The vicomte was very vexed at this, but he did not dare say anything for fear of giving rise to a scandal, and the priest continued to call down vengeance on their heads and to foretell the downfall of God's enemies in every sermon. At last Julien wrote a decided, though respectful, letter to the archbishop, and the Abbé Tolbiac, finding himself threatened with disgrace, ceased his denunciations. He began to take long solitary walks. Often he was to be met striding along the roads with an ardent, excited look on his face. Gilberte and Julien were always seeing him when they were out riding, sometimes in the distance on the other side of a common or on the edge of the cliff, sometimes close at hand, reading his breviary in a narrow valley they were just about to pass through. They always turned another way to avoid passing him. Spring had come, inflaming their hearts with fresh desires, and urging them to seek each other's embraces in any secluded spot to which their rides might lead them. But the leaves were only budding, the grass was still damp from the rains of winter, and they could not, as in the height of summer, hide themselves amidst the undergrowth of the woods. Lately they had generally sheltered their caresses within a movable shepherd's hut, which had been left since autumn on the very top of the Vaucotte hill. It stood all alone on the edge of the precipitous descent to the valley, 500 yards above the cliff. There they felt quite secure, for they overlooked the whole of the surrounding country, and they fastened their horses to the shafts to wait until their masters were satiated with love. One evening, as they were leaving the hut, they saw the Abbé Tolbiac sitting on the hillside, nearly hidden by the rushes. "We must leave our horses in that ravine another time," said Julien, "in case they should tell our whereabouts." And thenceforth they always tied the horses up in a kind of recess in the valley, which was hidden by bushes. Another evening they were both returning to La Vriette, where the comte was expecting Julien to dinner, when they met the cure coming out of the chateau. He bowed without looking them in the face, and stood on one side to let them pass. For the moment his visit made them uneasy, but their anxiety was soon dispelled. Jeanne was sitting by the fire reading one windy afternoon at the beginning of May, when she suddenly saw the Comte de Fourville running towards the chateau at such a rate as to make her fear he was the bearer of bad news. She hastened downstairs to meet him, and when she saw him close, she thought he must have gone mad. He had on his shooting jacket and a big fur cap that he generally only wore on his own grounds, and he was so pale that his red moustaches, which as a rule hardly showed against his ruddy face, looked the colour of flame. His eyes were haggard and stared vacantly or rolled from side to side. "My wife is here, isn't she?" he gasped. No," answered Jeanne, too frightened to think of what she was saying. " I have not seen her all day." The comte dropped into a chair, as if his legs had no longer strength to support him, and, taking off his cap, he mechanically passed his handkerchief several times across his forehead. Then he started to his feet and went towards Jeanne with outstretched hands and mouth open to speak and tell her of his terrible grief. But suddenly he stopped short, and, fixing his eyes on her, murmured, as if he were delirious :" But it is your husband — you also —" and, breaking off abruptly, he rushed out towards the sea. Jeanne ran after him, calling him and imploring him to stop. " He knows all," she thought in terror. " What will he do ? Oh, pray Heaven he may not find them." He did not listen to her, and, evidently knowing whither to direct his steps, ran straight on without any hesitation as to the path he should take. Already he had leapt across the ditch and was rapidly striding across the reeds towards the cliff. Finding she could not catch him up, Jeanne stood on the slope beyond the wood and watched him as long as he was in sight, then, when she could see him no longer, she went indoors again, tortured with fear and anxiety. When he reached the edge of the cliff the comte turned to the right and again began to run. The sea was very rough, and one after the other the heavy clouds came up and poured their contents on the land. A whistling, moaning wind swept over the grass, laying low the young barley, and carrying the great white sea gulls inland like sprays of foam. The rain, which came in gusts, beat in the comte's face and drenched his cheeks and moustaches, and the tumult of the elements seemed to fill his heart as well as his ears. There, straight before him in the distance, lay the Vaucotte valley, and between it and him stood a solitary shepherd's hut with 2 horses tied to the shafts. What fear could there be of anyone seeing them on such a day as this? As soon as he caught sight of the animals the comte threw himself flat on the ground and dragged himself along on his hands and knees, his hairy cap and mud-stained clothes making him look like some monstrous animal. He crawled to the lonely hut, and, in case its occupants should see him through the cracks in the planks, he hid himself beneath it. The horses had seen him and were pawing the ground. He slowly cut the reins by which they were fastened with a knife that he held open in his hand, and, as a fresh gust of wind swept by, the 2 animals cantered off, their backs stung by the hail which lashed against the sloping roof of the shepherd's cot and made the frail abode tremble on its wheels. Then the comte rose to his knees, put his eye to the slit at the bottom of the door, and remained perfectly motionless while he watched and waited. Some time passed thus, and then he suddenly leapt to his feet, covered with mire from head to foot. Furiously he fastened the bolt which secured the shelter on the outside, and, seizing the shafts, he shook the hut as if he would have broken it to atoms. After a moment he began to drag it along, exerting the strength of a bull, and bending nearly double in his tremendous effort, and it was towards the almost perpendicular slope to the valley that he hurried the cottage and its human occupants, who were desperately shouting and trying to burst open the door in their ignorance of what had happened. At the extreme edge of the slope the comte let go of the hut, and it at once began to run down towards the valley. At first it moved but slowly, but its speed increasing as it went, it moved quicker and quicker, until soon it was rushing down the hill at a tremendous rate. Its shafts bumped along the ground, and it leaped over and dashed against the obstacles in its path, as if it had been endowed with life. It bounded over the head of an old beggar who was crouching in a ditch, and as it passed, the man heard frightful cries issuing from within it. All at once one of the wheels was torn off, and the hut turned over on its side. That, however, did not stop it, and now it rolled over and over like a ball, or like some house uprooted from its foundations and hurled from the summit of a mountain. It rolled on until it reached the edge of the last ravine. There it took a final leap, and, after describing a curve, fell to the earth and smashed like an egg shell. Directly it had dashed upon the rocks at the bottom of the valley, the old beggar, who had seen it falling, began to make his way down through the brambles. He did not go straight to the shattered hut, but, like the cautious rustic that he was, went to announce the accident at the nearest farmhouse. The farm people ran to the spot the beggar pointed out, and beneath the fragments of the hut found 2 bruised and mangled corpses. The man's forehead was split open and his face crushed. The woman's jaw was almost separated from her head, and their broken limbs were as soft as if there had not been a bone beneath the flesh. Still the farmers could recognise them, and they began to make all sorts of conjectures as to the cause of the accident. "What could they have been doing in the cabin?" said a woman. The old beggar replied that apparently they had taken refuge from the weather, and that the high wind had overturned the hut and blown it down the precipice. He added that he himself was going to take shelter in it, when he saw the horses fastened to the shafts, and concluded that the place was already occupied. "If it hadn't been for that, I should have been where they are now," he said with an air of self-congratulation. "Perhaps it would have been all the better if you had been," said someone. "Why would it have been better?" exclaimed the beggar in a great rage. "'Cause I'm poor and they're rich? Look at them now," he said, pointing to the 2 corpses with his hooked stick, as he stood trembling and ragged, with the water dripping from him, and his battered hat, his matted beard, his long unkempt hair, making him look terribly dirty and miserable. "We're all equal when we're dead." The group had grown bigger, and the peasants stood round with a frightened, cowardly look on their faces. After a discussion as to what they had better do, it was finally decided to carry the bodies back to their homes, in the hope of getting a reward. 2 carts were got ready, and then a fresh difficulty arose. Some thought it would be quite enough to place straw at the bottom of the carts, and others thought it would look better to put mattresses. "But the mattresses would be soaked with blood," cried the woman who had spoken before. "They'd have to be washed with eau de javel." "The chateau people'll pay for that," said a jolly-faced farmer. "They can't expect to get things for nothing." That decided the matter, and the 2 carts set off, one to the right, the other to the left, jolting and shaking the remains of these 2 beings who had so often been clasped in each other's arms, but who would never meet again. When the comte had seen the hut set off on its terrible journey, he had fled away through the rain and the wind, and had run on and on across the country like a madman. He ran for several hours, heedless of which way his steps were taking him, and at nightfall he found himself at his own chateau. The servants were anxiously awaiting his return, and hastened to tell him that the 2 horses had just returned riderless, for Julien's had followed the other one. M. de Fourville staggered back. "Some accident must have happened to my wife and the vicomte," he said in broken tones. "Let everyone go and look for them." He started off again himself, as though he were going to seek them, but as soon as he was out of sight he hid behind a bush, and watched the road along which the woman he still loved so dearly would be brought, dead or dying, or perhaps maimed and disfigured for life. In a little while a cart passed by, bearing a strange load. It drew up before the chateau gates, then passed through them. Yes, he knew it was she, but the dread of hearing the horrible truth forced him to stay in his hiding place, and he crouched down like a hare, trembling at the faintest rustle. He waited for an hour, perhaps 2, and yet the cart did not come back again. He was persuaded that his wife was dying, and the thought of seeing her, of meeting her eyes, was such a torture to him, that, seized with a sudden fear of being discovered and compelled to witness her death, he again set off running, and did not stop till he was hidden in the midst of a wood. Then he thought that perhaps she needed help, and that there was no one to take care of her as he could, and he sped back in mad haste. As he was going into the house he met his gardener. "Well?" he cried excitedly. The man dared not answer the truth. "Is she dead?" almost yelled M. de Fourville. "Yes, Monsieur le Comte," stammered the servant. The comte experienced an intense relief at the answer. All his agitation left him, and he went quietly and firmly up the steps. In the meantime, the other cart had arrived at Les Peuples. Jeanne saw it in the distance, and guessing that a corpse lay upon the mattress, understood at once what had happened. The shock was so great that she fell to the ground unconscious. When she came to herself again, she found her father supporting her head and bathing her forehead with vinegar. "Do you know?" he asked hesitatingly. "Yes, father," she whispered, trying to rise, but she was in such pain that she was forced to sink back again. That evening she gave birth to a dead child, a girl. She did not see or hear anything of Julien's funeral, for she was delirious when he was buried. In a few days she was conscious of Aunt Lison's presence in her room, and in the midst of the feverish nightmares by which she was haunted, she strove to recall when and under what circumstances the old maid had last left Les Peuples. But even in her lucid moments she could not remember, and she could only feel sure she had seen her since the Baroness's death. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11, Part A of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 11, Part A. Jeanne was confined to her room for 3 months, and everyone despaired of her life, but very, very gradually health and strength returned to her. Her father and Aunt Lison had come to live at the chateau, and they nursed her day and night. The shock she had sustained had entirely upset her nervous system. She started at the least noise, and the slightest emotion caused her to go off into long swoons. She had never asked the details of Julien's death. Why should she? Did she not already know enough? Everyone except herself thought it had been an accident, and she never revealed to anyone the terrible secret of her husband's adultery and of the comte's sudden fearful visit the day of the catastrophe. Her soul was filled with the sweet, tender memories of the few short hours of bliss she owed to her husband, and she always pictured him to herself as he had been when they were betrothed, and when she had adored him in the only moments of sensual passion of her life. She forgot all his faults and harshness, even his infidelity seemed more pardonable now that death stood between him and her. She felt a sort of vague gratitude to this man who had clasped her in his arms, and she forgave him the sorrows he had caused her, and dwelt only on the happy moments they had passed together. As time wore on, and month followed month, covering her grief and memories with the dust of forgetfulness, Jeanne devoted herself entirely to her son. The child became the idol, the one engrossing thought of the 3 beings over whom he ruled like any despot. There was even a sort of jealousy between his 3 slaves, for Jeanne grudged the hearty kisses he gave the baron when the latter rode him on his knees, and Aunt Lison, who was neglected by this baby, as she had always been by everyone, and was regarded as a servant by this master who could not talk yet, would go to her room and cry as she compared the few kisses which she had so much difficulty in obtaining with the embraces the child so freely lavished on his mother and grandfather. 2 peaceful, uneventful years were passed thus in devoted attention to the child. Then, at the beginning of the 3rd winter, it was arranged that they should all go to Rouen until the spring. But they had hardly arrived at the damp old house before Paul had such a severe attack of bronchitis that pleurisy was feared. His distracted mother was convinced that no other air but that of Les Peuples agreed with him, and they all went back there as soon as he was well. Then came a series of quiet, monotonous years. Jeanne, her father, and Aunt Lison spent all their time with the child, and were continually going into raptures over the way he lisped, or with his funny sayings and doings. Jeanne lovingly called him Paulet, and when he tried to repeat the word, he made them all laugh by pronouncing it poulet, for he could not speak plainly. The nickname Poulet clung to him, and henceforth he was never called anything else. He grew very quickly, and one of the chief amusements of his 3 mothers, as the baron called them, was to measure his height. On the wainscoting by the drawing-room door was a series of marks made with a penknife, showing how much the boy had grown every month. And these marks, which were called Poulet's ladder, were of great importance in everyone's eyes. Then there came a very unexpected addition to the important personages of the household. The dog Massacre, which Jeanne had neglected since all her attention had been centred in her son. Ludivine fed him, and he lived quite alone and always on the chain in an old barrel in front of the stables. Paul noticed him one morning, and at once wanted to go and kiss him. The dog made a great fuss over the child, who cried when he was taken away, so Massacre was unchained and henceforth lived in the house. He became Paul's inseparable friend and companion. They played together, and lay down side by side on the carpet to go to sleep, and soon Massacre shared the bed of his playfellow, who would not let the dog leave him. Jeanne lamented sometimes over the fleas, and Aunt Lison felt angry with the dog for absorbing so much of the child's affection for which she longed, and which, it seemed to her, this animal had stolen. At long intervals, visits were exchanged with the Brisevilles and the Couteliers, but the mayor and the doctor were the only regular visitors at the chateau. The brutal way in which the priest had killed the dog, and the suspicions he had instilled into her mind about the time of Julien's and Gilberte's horrible death, had roused Jeanne's indignation against the God who could have such ministers, and she had entirely ceased to attend church. From time to time the abbé inveighed in outspoken terms against the chateau, which, he said, was inhabited by the spirit of evil, the spirit of everlasting rebellion, the spirit of errors and of lies, the spirit of iniquity, the spirit of corruption and impurity. It was by all these names that he alluded to the baron. The church was deserted, and when the curé happened to walk past any fields in which the ploughmen were at work, the men never ceased their task to speak to him, or turned to touch their hats. He acquired the reputation of being a wizard because he cast out the devil from a woman who was possessed, and the peasants believed he knew words to dispel charms. He laid his hands on cows that gave thin milk, discovered the whereabouts of things which had been lost by means of a mysterious incantation, and devoted his narrow mind to the study of all the ecclesiastical books in which he could find accounts of the devil's apparitions upon earth, or descriptions of his resources and stratagems, and the various ways in which he manifested his power and exercised his influence. Believing himself specially called to combat this invisible, harmful power, the priest had learnt all the forms given in religious manuals to exorcise the devil. He fancied Satan lurked in every shadow, and the phrase "Siet leo rugiens circuit, quærens quem devoret" was continually on his lips. People began to be afraid of his strange power, even his fellow clergy, ignorant country priests, to whom Beelzebub was an article of their faith, and who, perplexed by the minute directions for the rites to be observed in case of any manifestations of the evil one's power, at last confounded religion with magic, regarded the Abbé Tolbiac as somewhat of a wizard, and respected him as much for the supernatural power he was supposed to possess as for the irreproachable austerity of his life. The curé never bowed to Jeanne if he chanced to meet her, and such a state of things worried and grieved Aunt Lison, who could not understand how anyone could systematically stay away from church. Everyone took it for granted that she was religious, and confessed and communicated at proper intervals, and no one ever tried to find out what her views on religion really were. Whenever she was quite alone with Paul, Lison talked to him, in whispers, about the good God. The child listened to her with a faint degree of interest when she related the miracles which had been performed in the old times, and when she told him he must love the good God very, very dearly, he sometimes asked, "Where is he, Auntie?" She would point upwards and answer, "Up there, above the sky, Poulet, but you must not say anything about it," for she feared the baron would be angry if he knew what she was teaching the boy. One day, however, Poulet startled her by asserting, "The good God is everywhere except in church," and she found he had been talking to his grandfather about what she had told him. Paul was now 10 years old. His mother looked 40. He was strong, noisy, and boldly climbed the trees, but his education had, so far, been very neglected. He disliked lessons, would never settle down to them, and if ever the baron managed to keep him reading a little longer than usual, Jeanne would interfere, saying, "Let him go and play now. He is so young to be tired with books." In her eyes he was still an infant, and she hardly noticed that he walked, ran, and talked like a man in miniature. She lived in constant anxiety lest he should fall down, or get too cold or too hot, or overload his stomach, or not eat as much as his growth demanded. When the boy was 12 years old, a great difficulty arose about his first communion. Lise went to Jeanne's room one morning and pointed out to her that the child could not be permitted to go any longer without religious instruction, and without performing the simplest sacred duties. She called every argument to her aid, and gave 1,000 reasons for the necessity of what she was urging, dwelling chiefly upon the danger of scandal. The idea worried Jeanne, and unable to give a decided answer, she replied that Paul could very well go on as he was for a little longer. A month after this discussion with Lise, Jeanne called on the Vicomtesse de Briseville. "I suppose it will be Paul's first communion this year," said the Vicomtesse, in the course of conversation. "Yes, madame," answered Jeanne, taken unawares. These few words had the effect of deciding her, and without saying anything about it to her father, she asked Lise to take the child to the catechism class. Everything went on smoothly for a month. Then Poulet came back one evening with a sore throat, and the next day he began to cough. His frightened mother questioned him as to the cause of his cold, and he told her that he had not behaved very well in class, so the cure had sent him to wait at the door of the church, where there was a draught from the porch, until the end of the lesson. After that Jeanne kept him at home, and taught him his catechism herself, but the Abbé Tolbiac refused to admit him to communion, in spite of all Lison's entreaties, alleging as his reason that the boy had not been properly prepared. The following year he refused him again, and the baron was so exasperated that he said plainly there was no need for Paul to believe in such foolery as this absurd symbol of transubstantiation to become a good and honest man. So it was resolved to bring the boy up in the Christian faith, but not in the Catholic Church, and that he should decide his religion for himself when he reached his majority. A short time afterwards Jeanne called on the Brisevilles and received no visit in return. Knowing how punctilious they were in all matters of etiquette, she felt very much surprised at the omission, until the Marquise de Coutelier haughtily told her the reason of this neglect. Aware that her husband's rank and wealth made her the queen of the Normandy aristocracy, the Marquise ruled in queen-like fashion, showing herself gracious or severe as occasions demanded. She never hesitated to speak as she thought, and reproved or congratulated or corrected whenever she thought fit. When Jeanne called on her, she addressed a few icy words to her visitor, then said in a cold tone: "Society divides itself naturally into two classes, those who believe in God and those who do not. The former, however lowly they may be, are our friends and equals. With the latter we can have nothing to do." Jeanne felt that she was being attacked, and replied: "But cannot one believe in God without constantly attending church?" "No, madame. Believers go to pray to God in his church as they would go to visit their friends at their houses." "God is everywhere, madame, and not only in the churches," answered Jeanne, feeling very hurt. "I believe in his goodness and mercy from the bottom of my heart, but when there are certain priests between him and me, I can no longer realise his presence." "The priest is the standard bearer of the church, madame," said the Marquise, rising, "and whoever does not follow that flag is as much our enemy as the church is." Jeanne had risen also. "You believe in the God of a sect, madame," she replied, quivering with indignation. "I believe in the God whom every upright man reveres." And with a bow she left the Marquise. Among themselves the peasants also blamed Jeanne for not sending Poulet to his first communion. They themselves did not go to mass and never took the sacrament, or at least only at Easter when the Church formally commanded it, but when it came to the children, that was a different matter, and not one of them would have dared to bring a child up outside the common faith, for, after all, religion is religion. Jeanne was quite conscious of the disapproval with which everyone regarded her conduct, but such inconsistency only roused her indignation, and she scorned the people who could thus quiet their consciences so easily, and hide the cowardly fears which lurked at the bottom of their hearts under the mask of righteousness. The baron undertook to direct Paul's studies, and began to instruct him in Latin. The boy's mother had but one word to say on the subject: "Whatever you do, don't tire him." And while lessons were going on, she would anxiously hang round the door of the schoolroom, which her father had forbidden her to enter, because at every moment she interrupted his teaching to ask: "You're sure your feet are not cold, Poulet?" Or, "Your head does not ache, does it, Poulet?" Or to admonish the master with: "Don't make him talk so much, he will have a sore throat." As soon as lessons were over, the boy went into the garden with his mother and aunt. They were all three very fond of gardening, and took great pleasure and interest in planting and pruning, in watching the seeds they had sown come up and blossom, and in cutting flowers for nosegays. Paul devoted himself chiefly to raising salad plants. He had the entire care of 4 big beds in the kitchen garden, and there he cultivated lettuce, endive, cos lettuce, mustard cress, and every other known kind of salad. He dug, watered, weeded, and planted, and made his 2 mothers work like day labourers, and for hours together they knelt on the borders, soiling their hands and dresses as they planted the seedlings in the holes they made with their forefingers in the mould. Poulet was almost 15. He had grown wonderfully, and the highest mark on the drawing-room wall was over 5 feet from the ground. But in mind he was still an ignorant, foolish child, for he had no opportunity of expanding his intellect, confined as he was to the society of these 2 women and the good-tempered old man, who was so far behind the times. At last one evening the baron said it was time for the boy to go to college. Aunt Lison withdrew into a dark corner in horror at the idea, and Jeanne began to sob. "Why does he want to know so much?" she replied. "We will bring him up to be a gentleman farmer, to devote himself to the cultivation of his property, as so many noblemen do, and he will pass his life happily in this house, where we have lived before him and where we shall die. What more can he want?" The baron shook his head. "What answer will you make if he comes to you a few years hence and says, 'I am nothing and I know nothing through your selfish love. I feel incapable of working or of becoming anyone now, and yet I know I was not intended to lead the dull, pleasureless life to which your short-sighted affection has condemned me?'" Jeanne turned to her son with the tears rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, Poulet, you will never reproach me for having loved you too much, will you?" "No, mamma," promised the boy in surprise. "You swear you will not?" "Yes, mamma." "You want to stay here, don't you?" "Yes, mamma." "Jeanne, you have no right to dispose of his life in that way," said the baron sternly. "Such conduct is cowardly, almost criminal. You are sacrificing your child to your own personal happiness." Jeanne hid her face in her hands, while her sobs came in quick succession. "I have been so unhappy, she murmured through her tears. "And now my son has brought peace and rest into my life, you want to take him from me. What will become of me if I am left all alone?" Her father went and sat down by her side. "And am I no one, Jeanne?" he asked, taking her in his arms. She threw her arms round his neck and kissed him fondly. Then, in a voice still choked with tears and sobs: "Yes, perhaps you are right, papa dear," she answered, "and I was foolish, but I have had so much sorrow. I am quite willing for him to go to college now." Then Poulet, who hardly understood what was going to be done with him, began to cry too, and his 3 mothers kissed and coaxed him and told him to be brave. They all went up to bed with heavy hearts, and even the baron wept when he was alone in his room, though he had controlled his emotions downstairs. It was resolved to send Paul to the college at Havre at the beginning of the next term, and during the summer he was more spoilt than ever. His mother moaned as she thought of the approaching separation, and she got ready as many clothes for the boy as if he had been about to start on a 10 years' journey. One October morning, after a sleepless night, the baron, Jeanne, and Aunt Lison went away with Poulet in the landau. They had already paid a visit to fix upon the bed he was to have in the dormitory, and the seat he was to occupy in class, and this time Jeanne and Aunt Lison passed the whole day in unpacking his things and arranging them in the little chest of drawers. As the latter would not contain the quarter of what she had brought, Jeanne went to the headmaster to ask if the boy could not have another. The steward was sent for, and he said that so much linen and so many clothes were simply in the way, instead of being of any use, and that the rules of the house forbade him to allow another chest of drawers. So Jeanne made up her mind to hire a room in a little hotel close by, and to ask the landlord himself to take Poulet all he wanted directly the child found himself in need of anything. They all went on the pier for the rest of the afternoon, and watched the ships entering and leaving the harbour. Then at nightfall they went to a restaurant for dinner, but they were too unhappy to eat, and the dishes were placed before them and removed almost untouched as they sat looking at each other with tearful eyes. After dinner they walked slowly back to the college. Boys of all ages were arriving on every side, some accompanied by their parents, others by servants. A great many were crying, and the big dim courtyard was filled with the sound of tears. When the time came to say good-bye, Jeanne and Poulet clung to each other as if they could not part, while Aunt Lison stood, quite forgotten, in the background, with her face buried in her handkerchief. The baron felt he too was giving way, so he hastened the farewells, and took his daughter from the college. The landau was waiting at the door, and they drove back to Les Peuples in a silence that was only broken by an occasional sob. Jeanne wept the whole of the following day, and the next she ordered the phaeton and drove over to Havre. Poulet seemed to have got over the separation already. It was the first time he had ever had any companions of his own age, and as he sat beside his mother he fidgeted on his chair and longed to run out and play. Every other day Jeanne went to see him, and on Sundays took him out. She felt as though she had not energy enough to leave the college between the recreation hours, so she waited in the parlour while the classes were going on until Poulet could come to her again. At last the headmaster asked her to go up and see him, and begged her not to come so often. She did not take any notice of his request, and he warned her that if she still persisted in preventing her son from enjoying his play hours, and in interrupting his work, he would be obliged to dismiss him from the college. He also sent a note to the baron to the same effect, and thenceforth Jeanne was always kept in sight at Les Peuples like a prisoner. She lived in a constant state of nervous anxiety, and looked forward to the holidays with more impatience than her son. She began to take long walks about the country, with Massacre as her only companion, and would stay out of doors all day long, dreamily musing. Sometimes she sat on the cliff the whole afternoon watching the sea. Sometimes she walked across the wood to Yport, thinking as she went of how she had walked there when she was young, and of the long, long years which had elapsed since she had bounded along these very paths, a hopeful, happy girl. Every time she saw her son, it seemed to Jeanne as if 10 years had passed since she had seen him last, for every month he became more of a man, and every month she became more aged. Her father looked like her brother, and Aunt Lison, who had been quite faded when she was 25, and had never seemed to get older since, might have been taken for her elder sister. Poulet did not study very hard. He spent 2 years in the 4th form, managed to get through the 3rd in 1 12-month, then spent 2 more in the 2nd, and was nearly 20 when he reached the rhetoric class. He had grown into a tall, fair youth, with whiskered cheeks and a budding moustache. He came over to Les Peuples every Sunday now, instead of his mother going to see him, and as he had been taking riding lessons for some time past, he hired a horse and accomplished the journey from Havre in 2 hours. Every Sunday Jeanne started out early in the morning to go and meet him on the road, and with her went Aunt Lison and the baron, who was beginning to stoop, and who walked like a little old man, with his hands clasped behind his back, as if to prevent himself from pitching forward on his face. The 3 walked slowly along, sometimes sitting down by the wayside to rest, and all the while straining their eyes to catch the first glimpse of the rider. As soon as he appeared, looking like a black speck on the white road, they waved their handkerchiefs, and he at once put his horse at a gallop and came up like a whirlwind, frightening his mother and Aunt Lison, and making his grandfather exclaim "Bravo!" in the admiration of impotent old age. Although Paul was a head taller than his mother, she always treated him as if he were a child, and still asked him, as in former years: "Your feet are not cold, are they, Poulet?" If he went out of doors after lunch to smoke a cigarette, she opened the window to cry: "Oh, don't go out there without a hat, you'll catch cold in your head." And when at night he mounted his horse to return, she could hardly contain herself for nervousness, and entreated her son not to be reckless. "Do not ride too quickly, Poulet dear," she would say. "Think of your poor mother, who would go mad if anything happened to you, and be careful." One Saturday morning she received a letter from Paul to say he should not come to Les Peuples as usual the following day, as he had been invited to a party some of his college friends had got up. The whole of Sunday Jeanne was tortured by a presentiment of evil, and when Thursday came she was unable to bear her suspense any longer, and went over to Havre. Paul seemed changed, though she could hardly tell in what way. He seemed more spirited, and his words and tones were more manly. "By the way, mamma, we are going on another excursion, and I shan't come to Les Peuples next Sunday, as you have come to see me to day," he said all at once, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jeanne felt as much surprised and stunned as if he had told her he was going to America. Then, when she was again able to speak: "Oh, Poulet," she exclaimed, "what is the matter with you? Tell me what is going on." He laughed and gave her a kiss. "Why, nothing at all, mamma. I am only going to enjoy myself with some friends, as everyone does at my age." She made no reply, but when she was alone in the carriage, her head was filled with new and strange ideas. She had not recognised her Poulet, her little Poulet, as of old. She perceived for the first time that he was grown up, that he was no longer hers, that henceforth he was going to live his own life, independently of the old people. To her he seemed to have changed entirely in a day. What! Was this strong, bearded, firm-willed lad her son, her little child who used to make her help him plant his lettuces? Chapter 11 Part B of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 11 Part B. Paul only came to Les Peuples at very long intervals for the next 3 months, and even when he was there it was only too plain that he longed to get away again as soon as possible, and that each evening he tried to leave an hour earlier. Jeanne imagined all sorts of things while the baron tried to console her by saying: "There, let him alone. The boy is 20 years old, you know." One morning a shabbily dressed old man who spoke with a German accent asked for "Madame la Vicomtesse." He was shown in, and after a great many ceremonious bows, pulled out a dirty pocket book, saying: "I have a little paper for you," and then unfolded and held out a greasy scrap of paper. Jeanne read it over twice, looked at the Jew, read it over again, then asked: "What does it mean?" "I will tell you," replied the man obsequiously. "Your son wanted a little money, and as I know what a good mother you are, I lent him just a little to go on with." Jeanne was trembling. But why did he not come to me for it? The Jew entered into a long explanation about a gambling debt which had to be paid on a certain morning before midday, that no one would lend Paul anything as he was not yet of age, and that his honour would have been compromised if he, the Jew, had not rendered this little service to the young man. Jeanne wanted to send for the baron, but her emotion seemed to have taken all the strength from her limbs, and she could not rise from her seat. "Would you be kind enough to ring?" she said to the moneylender at last. He feared some trick, and hesitated for a moment. "If I inconvenience you, I will call again," he stammered. She answered him by a shake of the head, and when he had rung they waited in silence for the baron. The latter at once understood it all. The bill was for 1,500 francs. He paid the Jew 1,000, saying to him: "Don't let me see you here again." and the man thanked him, bowed, and went away. Jeanne and the baron at once went over to Havre, but when they arrived at the college they learnt that Paul had not been there for a month. The principal had received 4 letters, apparently from Jeanne, the first telling him that his pupil was ill, the others to say how he was getting on, and each letter was accompanied by a doctor's certificate. Of course they were all forged. Jeanne and her father looked at each other in dismay when they heard this news, and the principal, feeling very sorry for them, took them to a magistrate that the police might be set to find the young man. Jeanne and the baron slept at an hotel that night, and the next day Paul was discovered at the house of a fast woman. His mother and grandfather took him back with them to Les Peuples, and the whole of the way not a word was exchanged. Jeanne hid her face in her handkerchief and cried, and Paul looked out of the window with an air of indifference. Before the end of the week they found out that, during the last 3 months, Paul had contracted debts to the amount of 15,000 francs, but the creditors had not gone to his relations about the money, because they knew the boy would soon be of age. Paulo was asked for no explanation and received no reproof, as his relations hoped to reform him by kindness. He was pampered and caressed in every way. The choicest dishes were prepared for him, and as it was springtime, a boat was hired for him at Yport, in spite of Jeanne's nervousness that he might go sailing whenever he liked. The only thing that was denied him was a horse, for fear he should ride to Havre. He became very irritable and passionate, and lived a perfectly aimless life. The baron grieved over his neglected studies, and even Jeanne, much as she dreaded to be parted from him again, began to wonder what was to be done with him. One evening he did not come home. It was found on inquiry that he had gone out in a boat with 2 sailors, and his distracted mother hurried down to Yport without stopping even to put anything over her head. On the beach she found a few men awaiting the return of the boat, and out on the sea was a little swaying light, which was drawing nearer and nearer to the shore. The boat came in, but Paul was not on board. He had ordered the men to take him to Havre, and had landed there. The police sought him in vain. He was nowhere to be found, and the woman who had hidden him once before had sold all her furniture, paid her rent, and disappeared also, without leaving any trace behind her. In Paul's room at Les Peuples 2 letters were found from this creature, who seemed madly in love with him, saying that she had obtained the necessary money for a journey to England. The 3 inmates of the chateau lived on, gloomy and despairing, through all this mental torture. Jeanne's hair, which had been grey before, was now quite white, and she sometimes asked herself what she could have done, that fate should so mercilessly pursue her. One day she received the following letter from Abbé Tolbiac: "Madame, the hand of God has been laid heavily upon you. You refused to give your son to him, and he has delivered him over to a prostitute. Will you not profit by this lesson from heaven? God's mercy is infinite, and perhaps he will pardon you if you throw yourself at his feet. I am his humble servant, and I will open his door to you when you come and knock." Jeanne sat for a long time with this letter lying open on her knees. Perhaps, after all, the priest's words were true, and all her religious doubts and uncertainties returned to harass her mind. Was it possible that God could be vindictive and jealous like men? But if he was not jealous, he would no longer be feared and loved, and no doubt it was that we might the better know him that he manifested himself to men as influenced by the same feeling as themselves. Then she felt the fear, the cowardly dread, which urges those who hesitate and doubt to seek the safety of church. And one evening, when it was dark, she stealthily ran to the vicarage and knelt at the foot of the fragile-looking priest to solicit absolution. He only promised her a semi-pardon, as God could not shower all his favours on a house which sheltered such a man as the baron. "Still, you will soon receive a proof of the divine mercy," said the priest. 2 days later, Jeanne did indeed receive a letter from her son, and in the excess of her grief she looked upon it as the forerunner of the consolation promised by the abbé. The letter ran thus: "My dear mother, do not be uneasy about me. I am at London and in good health, but in great need of money. We have not a sou, and some days we have to go without anything to eat. She who is with me, and whom I love with all my heart, has spent all she had, some 5,000 francs, that she might remain with me, and you will, of course, understand that I am bound in honour to discharge my debt to her at the very first opportunity. I shall soon be of age, but it would be very good of you if you would advance me 15,000 francs of what I inherit from papa. It would relieve me from great embarrassments. Good bye, mother dear. I hope soon to see you again, but in the meantime I send much love to grandfather, Aunt Lison, and yourself. Your son, Vicomte Paul de la Mare. Then he had not forgotten her, for he had written to her. She did not stop to think that it was simply to ask her for money. He had not any, and some should be sent him. What did money matter? He had written to her. She ran to show the letter to the baron, the tears streaming from her eyes. Aunt Lison was called, and word by word they read over this letter which spoke of their loved one, and lingered over every sentence. Jeanne, transported from the deepest despair to a kind of intoxication of joy, began to take Paul's part. "Now he has written, he will come back," she said. "I am sure he will come back." "Still, he left us for this creature," said the baron, who was calm enough to reason, "and he must love her better than he does us, since he did not hesitate in his choice between her and his home." The words sent a pang of anguish through Jeanne's heart, and within her sprang up the fierce, deadly hatred of a jealous mother against the woman who had robbed her of her son. Until then her every thought had been for Paul, and she had hardly realised that this creature was the cause of all his errors. But the baron's argument had suddenly brought this rival, who possessed such fatal influence, vividly to her mind, and she felt that between this woman and herself there must be a determined, bitter warfare. With that thought came another one as terrible, that she would rather lose her son than share him with this other, and all her joy and delight vanished. The 15,000 francs were sent, and for 5 months nothing more was heard of Paul. At the end of that time a lawyer came to the chateau to see about his inheritance. Jeanne and the baron acceded to all his demands without any dispute, even giving up the money to which the mother had a right for her lifetime. And when he returned to Paris, Paul found himself the possessor of 120,000 francs. During the next 6 months only 4 short letters were received from him, giving news of his doings in a few concise sentences, and ending with formal protestations of affection. "I am not idle," he said. "I have obtained a post in connection with the Stock Exchange, and I hope some day to see my dear relations at Les Peuples." He never mentioned his mistress, but his silence was more significant than if he had written 4 pages about her. And in these icy letters Jeanne could perceive the influence of this unknown woman, who was, by instinct, the implacable enemy of every mother. Ponder as they would, the 3 lonely beings at the chateau could think of no means by which they might rescue Paul from his present life. They would have gone to Paris, but they knew that would be no good. "We must let his passion wear itself out," said the baron. "Sooner or later he will return to us of his own accord." And the mournful days dragged on. Jeanne and Lison got into the habit of going to church together without letting the baron know, and a long time passed without any news from Paul. Then one morning they received a desperate letter which terrified them. "My dear mother, I am lost. I shall have no resource left but to blow out my brains if you do not help me. A speculation which held out every hope of success has turned the wrong way, and I owe 85,000 francs. It means dishonour, ruin, the destruction of all my future if I do not pay. And I say again, rather than survive the disgrace, I will blow my brains out. I should perhaps have done so already had it not been for the brave and hopeful words of a woman whose name I never mentioned to you, but who is the good genius of my life. I send you my very best love, dear mother. Good bye, perhaps for ever. Paul." Enclosed in the letter was a bundle of business papers giving the details of this unfortunate speculation. The baron answered by return post that they would help as much as they could. Then he went to Havre to get legal advice, mortgaged some property, and forwarded the money to Paul. The young man wrote back 3 letters full of hearty thanks, and said they might expect him almost immediately. But he did not come, and another year passed away. Jeanne and the baron were on the point of starting for Paris to find him and make one last effort to persuade him to return, when they received a few lines saying he was again in London, starting a steamboat company which was to trade under the name of Paul Delamare and Company. "I am sure to get a living out of it," he wrote, "and perhaps it will make my fortune. At any rate, I risk nothing, and you must at once see the advantages of the scheme. When I see you again, I shall be well up in the world. There is nothing like trade for making money nowadays." 3 months later, the company went into liquidation, and the manager was prosecuted for falsifying the books. When the news reached Les Peuples, Jeanne had a hysterical fit which lasted several hours. The baron went to Havre, made every inquiry, saw lawyers and attorneys, and found that the Delamare Company had failed for 250,000 francs. He again mortgaged his property, and borrowed a large sum on Les Peuples and the 2 adjoining farms. One evening he was going through some final formalities in a lawyer's office, when he suddenly fell to the ground in an apoplectic fit. A mounted messenger was at once dispatched to Jeanne, but her father died before she could arrive. The shock was so great that it seemed to stun Jeanne, and she could not realise her loss. The body was taken back to Les Peuples, but the Abbé Tolbiac refused to allow it to be interred with any sacred rites, in spite of all the entreaties of the 2 women. So the burial took place at night without any ceremony whatever. Then Jeanne fell into a state of such utter depression that she took no interest in anything, and seemed unable to comprehend the simplest things. Paul, who was still in hiding in England, heard of his grandfather's death through the liquidators of the company, and wrote to say he should have come before, but he had only just heard the sad news. He concluded: "Now you have rescued me from my difficulties, mother dear, I shall return to France, and shall at once come to see you." Towards the end of that winter, Aunt Lison, who was now 68, had a severe attack of bronchitis. It turned to inflammation of the lungs, and the old maid quietly expired. "I will ask the good God to take pity on you, my dear little Jeanne," were the last words she uttered. Jeanne followed her to the grave, saw the earth fall on the coffin, and then sank to the ground, longing for death to take her also, that she might cease to think and to suffer. As she fell, a big, strong peasant woman caught her in her arms, and carried her away as if she had been a child. She took her back to the chateau, and Jeanne let herself be put to bed by this stranger, who handled her so tenderly and firmly, and at once fell asleep, for she had spent the last 5 nights watching beside the old maid, and she was thoroughly exhausted by sorrow and fatigue. It was the middle of the night when she again opened her eyes. A night lamp was burning on the mantelpiece, and in the armchair lay a woman asleep. Jeanne did not know who it was, and leaning over the side of the bed, she tried to make out her features by the glimmering light of the night lamp. She fancied she had seen this face before, but she could not remember when or where. The woman was quietly sleeping, her head drooping on one shoulder, her cap lying on the ground, and her big hands hanging on each side of the armchair. She was a strong, square-built peasant of about 40 or 45, with a red face and hair that was turning grey. Jeanne was sure she had seen her before, but she had not the least idea whether it was a long time ago or quite recently, and it worried her to find she could not remember. She softly got out of bed and went on tiptoe to see the sleeping woman nearer. She recognised her as the peasant who had caught her in her arms in the cemetery, and had afterwards put her to bed. But surely she had known her in former times, under other circumstances. And yet perhaps the face was only familiar to her because she had seen it that day in the cemetery. Still, how was it that the woman was sleeping here? Just then the stranger opened her eyes and saw Jeanne standing beside her. She started up, and they stood face to face, so close together that they touched each other. "How is it that you're out of bed?" said the peasant. "You'll make yourself ill, getting up at this time of night. Go back to bed again." "Who are you?" asked Jeanne. The woman made no answer, but picked Jeanne up and carried her back to bed as easily as if she had been a baby. She gently laid her down, and as she bent over her, she suddenly began to cover her cheeks, her hair, her eyes with violent kisses, while the tears streamed from her eyes. "My poor mistress, Mam'selle Jeanne, my poor mistress, don't you know me?" she sobbed. "Rosalie, my lass," cried Jeanne, throwing her arms round the woman's neck and kissing her, and clasped in each other's arms, they mingled their tears and sobs together. Rosalie dried her eyes the first. "Come now," she said, "you must be good and not catch cold." She picked up the clothes, tucked up the bed, and put the pillow back under the head of her former mistress, who lay choking with emotion as the memories of days that were past and gone rushed back to her mind. "How is it that you have come back, my poor girl?" she asked. "Do you think I was going to leave you to live all alone now?" answered Rosalie. "Light a candle and let me look at you," went on Jeanne. Rosalie placed a light on the table by the bedside, and for a long time they gazed at each other in silence. "I should never have known you again," murmured Jeanne, holding out her hand to her old servant. "You have altered very much, though not so much as I have." "Yes, you have changed, Madame Jeanne, and more than you ought to have done," answered Rosalie, as she looked at this thin, faded, white-haired woman whom she had left young and beautiful. "But you must remember it's 24 years since we have seen one another." "Well, have you been happy?" asked Jeanne, after a long pause. "Oh, yes, yes, madame. I haven't had much to grumble at. I've been happier than you, that's certain. The only thing that I've always regretted is that I didn't stop here." She broke off abruptly, finding she had unthinkingly touched upon the very subject she wished to avoid. "Well, you know, Rosalie, one cannot have everything one wants," replied Jeanne gently. "And now you, too, are a widow, are you not?" Then her voice trembled as she went on. "Have you any other children?" "No, madame." "And what is your son? Are you satisfied with him?" "Yes, madame. He's a good lad, and a hard-working one. He married about 6 months ago, and he is going to have the farm now I have come back to you." "Then you will not leave me again?" murmured Jeanne. "No fear, madame," answered Rosalie in a rough tone. "I've arranged all about that." And for some time nothing more was said. Jeanne could not help comparing Rosalie's life with her own, but she had become quite resigned to the cruelty and injustice of fate, and she felt no bitterness as she thought of the difference between her maid's peaceful existence and her own. "Was your husband kind to you?" "Oh, yes, madame. He was a good, industrious fellow, and managed to put by a good deal. He died of consumption." Jeanne sat up in bed. "Tell me all about your life, and everything that has happened to you," she said. "I feel as if it would do me good to hear it." Rosalie drew up a chair, sat down, and began to talk about herself, her house, her friends, entering into all the little details in which country people delight, laughing sometimes over things which made her think of the happy times that were over, and gradually raising her voice as she went on, like a woman accustomed to command, she wound up by saying: "Oh, I'm well off now. I needn't be afraid of anything. But I owe it all to you," she added in a lower, faltering voice. "And now I've come back I'm not going to take any wages. No, I won't. So if you don't choose to have me on those terms, I shall go away again." "But you do not mean to serve me for nothing?" said Jeanne. "Yes, I do, madame. Money. You give me money. Why, I've almost as much as you have yourself. Do you know how much you will have after all these loans and mortgages have been cleared off, and you have paid all the interest you have let run on and increase? You don't know, do you? Well, then, let me tell you that you haven't 10,000 livres a year, not 10,000. But I'm going to put everything straight, and pretty soon, too." She had again raised her voice, for the thought of the ruin which hung over the house, and the way in which the interest money had been neglected and allowed to accumulate, roused her anger and indignation. A faint, sad smile which passed over her mistress's face angered her still more, and she cried: "You ought not to laugh at it, madame. People are good for nothing without money." Jeanne took both the servant's hands in hers. "I have never had any luck," she said slowly, as if she could think of nothing else. "Everything has gone the wrong way with me. My whole life has been ruined by a cruel fate." "You must not talk like that, madame," said Rosalie, shaking her head. You made an unhappy marriage, that's all. But people oughtn't to marry before they know anything about their future husbands." They went on talking about themselves and their past loves like two old friends, and when the day dawned they had not yet told all they had to say. Chapter 12 of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 12. In less than a week, Rosalie had everything and everybody in the chateau under her control, and even Jeanne yielded a passive obedience to the servant, who scolded her or soothed her as if she had been a sick child. She was very weak now, and her legs dragged along as the baroness's used to do. The maid supported her when she went out, and their conversation was always about bygone times, of which Jeanne talked with tears in her eyes, and Rosalie in a calm, quiet way of an impassive peasant. The old servant returned several times to the question of the interest that was owing, and demanded the papers which Jeanne, ignorant of all business matters, had hidden away that Rosalie might not know of Paul's misdoings. Next, Rosalie went over to Fécamp each day for a week to get everything explained to her by a lawyer whom she knew. Then, one evening, after she had put her mistress to bed, she sat down beside her and said abruptly: "Now you're in bed, madame, we will have a little talk." She told Jeanne exactly how matters stood, and that when every claim had been settled, she, Jeanne, would have about 7,000 or 8,000 francs a year, not a penny more. "Well, Rosalie," answered Jeanne, "I know I shall not live to be very old, and I shall have enough until I die." "Very likely you will, madame," replied Rosalie, getting angry. "But how about Monsieur Paul? Don't you mean to leave him anything?" Jeanne shuddered. "Pray don't ever speak to me about him. I cannot bear to think of him." "Yes, but I want to talk to you about him, because you don't look at things in the right light, Madame Jeanne. He may be doing all sorts of foolish things now, but he won't always behave the same. He'll marry, and then he'll want money to educate his children and to bring them up properly. Now, listen to what I am going to say. You must sell Les Peuples." But Jeanne started up in bed. "Sell Les Peuples? How can you think of such a thing? No, I will never sell the chateau." Rosalie was not in the least put out. "But I say you will, madame, simply because you must." Then she explained her plans and her calculations. She had already found a purchaser for Les Peuples and the 2 adjoining farms, and when they had been sold, Jeanne would still have 4 farms at Saint Léonard, which, freed from the mortgages, would bring in about 8,300 francs a year. Out of this income, 1,300 francs would have to go for the keeping up and repairing of the property. 2,000 would be put by for unforeseen expenses, and Jeanne would have 5,000 francs to live upon. "Everything else is gone, so there's an end of it," said Rosalie. "But in future I shall keep the money, and Monsieur Paul shan't have another penny off you. He'd take your last farthing." "But if he has not anything to eat?" murmured Jeanne, who was quietly weeping. "He can come to us if he's hungry. There'll always be victuals and a bed for him. He'd never have got into trouble if you hadn't given him any money the first time he asked for some." "But he was in debt. He would have been dishonoured." "And don't you think he'll get into debt just the same when you've no more money to give him? You have paid his debts up to now, so well and good, but you won't pay any more, I can tell you. And now, good night, madame." And away she went. The idea of selling Les Peuples and leaving the house where she had passed all her life threw Jeanne into a state of extreme agitation, and she lay awake the whole night. "I shall never be able to go away from here," she said, when Rosalie came into the room next morning. "You'll have to, all the same, madame," answered the maid, with rising temper. "The lawyer is coming presently with the man who wants to buy the chateau, and if you don't sell it, you won't have a blade of grass to call your own in 4 years' time." "Oh, I cannot, moaned Jeanne. But an hour afterwards came a letter from Paul, asking for 10,000 francs. What was to be done? Jeanne did not know, and, in her distress, she consulted Rosalie, who shrugged her shoulders and observed: "What did I tell you, madame? Oh, you'd both of you have been in a nice muddle if I hadn't come back." Then, by her advice, Jeanne wrote back: My dear son, I cannot help you any more. You have ruined me, and I am even obliged to sell Les Peuples. But I shall always have a home for you whenever you choose to return to your poor old mother, who has suffered so cruelly through you. Jeanne. The lawyer came with Monsieur Geffrin, who was a retired sugar baker, and Jeanne herself received them and invited them to go all over the house and grounds. Then a month after this visit she signed the deed of sale, and bought, at the same time, a little villa in the hamlet of Batteville, standing on the Montivilliers high road, near Goderville. After she had signed the deeds, she went out to the Baroness's avenue and walked up and down, heartbroken and miserable, while she bade tearful, despairing farewells to the trees, the worm-eaten bench under the plane tree, the wood, the old elm trunk against which she had leant so many times, and the hillock where she had so often sat, and whence she had watched the Comte de Fourville running towards the sea on the awful day of Julien's death. She stayed out until the evening, and at last Rosalie went to look for her and brought her in. A tall peasant of about 25 was waiting at the door. He greeted Jeanne in a friendly way, as if he had known her a long while. "Good day, Madame Jeanne, how are you? Mother told me I was to come and help with the moving, and I wanted to know what you meant to take with you, so that I could move it a little at a time, without it hindering the farm work." He was Rosalie's son, Julien's son and Paul's brother. Jeanne's heart almost stood still as she looked at him, and yet she would have liked to kiss the young fellow. She gazed at him, trying to find any likeness to her husband or her son. He was robust and ruddy-cheeked, and had his mother's fair hair and blue eyes. But there was something in his face which reminded Jeanne of Julien, though she could not discover where the resemblance lay. "I should be very much obliged if you could show me the things now," continued the lad. But she did not know herself yet what she would be able to take, her new house was so small, and she asked him to come again in a week's time. For some time the removal occupied Jeanne's thoughts and made a change, though a sad one, in her dull, hopeless life. She went from room to room, seeking the pieces of furniture which were associated in her mind with various events in her life, for the furniture among which we live becomes, in time, part of our lives, almost of ourselves. And as it gets old, and we look at its faded colours, its frayed coverings, its tattered linings, we are reminded of the prominent dates and events of our existence by these time-worn objects which have been the mute companions of our happy and of our sad moments alike. As agitated as if the decisions she were making had been of the last importance, Jeanne chose, one by one, the things she should take with her, often hesitating and altering her mind at every moment, as she stood unable to decide the respective merits of 2 armchairs, or of some old escritoire and a still older work table. She opened and searched every drawer, and tried to connect every object with something that had happened in bygone days, and when at last she made up her mind and said, "Yes, I shall take this," the article she had decided upon was taken downstairs and put into the dining room. She wished to keep the whole of her bedroom furniture, the bed, the tapestry, the clock, everything, and she also took a few of the drawing room chairs, choosing those with the designs she had always liked ever since she could remember, the fox and the stork, the fox and the crow, the ant and the grasshopper, and the solitary heron. One day, as she was wandering all over this house she should so soon have to leave, Jeanne went up into the garret. She was amazed when she opened the door. There lay articles of furniture of every description, some broken, others only soiled, others again stored away simply because fresh things had been bought and put in their places. She recognised 100 little odds and ends which used to be downstairs and had disappeared without her noticing their absence. Things of no value which she had often used, insignificant little articles which had stood 15 years beneath her eyes and had never attracted her attention, but which now, suddenly discovered in the lumber room, lying side by side with other things older still, and which she could quite distinctly remember seeing when she first returned from the convent, became as precious in her eyes as if they had been valued friends that had been a long time absent from her. They appeared to her under a new light, and as she looked at them she felt as she might have done, if any very reserved acquaintances, had suddenly begun to talk and to reveal things and feelings she had never dreamed they possessed. As she went from one thing to another, and remembered little incidents in connection with them, her heart felt as if it would break. Why, this is the china cup I cracked a few days before I was married. And here is mamma's little lantern. And the cane papa broke trying to open the wooden gate the rain had swollen. Besides all these familiar objects, there were a great many things she had never seen before, which had belonged to her grandparents or her great-grandparents. Covered with dust, they looked like sad, forsaken exiles from another century, their history and adventures for ever lost. For there was no one living now who had known those who had chosen, bought, and treasured them, or who had seen the hands which had so often touched them, or the eyes which had found such pleasure in looking at them. Jeanne touched them and turned them about, her fingers leaving their traces on the thick dust. And she stayed for a long, long time amidst these old things, in the garret which was dimly lighted by a little skylight. She tried to find other things with associations to them, and very carefully she examined some three-legged chairs, a copper warming pan, a dented foot warmer, which she thought she remembered, and all the other worn-out household utensils. Then she put all the things she thought she should like to take away together, and going downstairs, sent Rosalie up to fetch them. The latter indignantly refused to bring down such rubbish, but Jeanne, though she hardly ever showed any will of her own, now would have her own way this time, and the servant had to obey. One morning, Denis Lecoq, Julien's son, came with his cart to take away the first lot of things, and Rosalie went off with him to look after the unloading and to see that the furniture was put into the right rooms. When she was alone, Jeanne began to visit every room in the chateau and to kiss in a transport of passionate sorrow and regret everything that she was forced to leave behind her. The big white birds in the drawing-room tapestry, the old candlesticks, anything and everything that came in her way. She went from room to room, half mad with grief, and the tears streaming from her eyes, and when she had gone all over the house, she went out to say good-bye to the sea. It was the end of September, and the dull yellowish waves stretched away as far as the eye could reach, under the lowering grey sky which hung over the world. For a long, long while Jeanne stood on the cliff, her thoughts running on all her sorrows and troubles, and it was not till night drew on that she went indoors. In that day she had gone through as much suffering as she had ever passed through in her greatest griefs. Rosalie had returned enchanted with the new house, which was much livelier than this big barn of a place that was not even on a main road, but her mistress wept the whole evening. Now they knew the chateau was sold, the farmers showed Jeanne barely the respect that was due to her, and though they hardly knew why, among themselves they always spoke of her as the lunatic. Perhaps with their brute-like instinct they perceived her unhealthy and increasing sentimentality, her morbid reveries, and the disordered and pitiful state of her mind, which so much sorrow and affliction had unhinged. Happening to go through the stables the day before she was to leave Les Peuples, Jeanne came upon Massacre, whose existence she had entirely forgotten. Long past the age at which dogs generally die, he had become blind and paralysed, and dragged out his life on a bed of straw, whither Ludivine, who never forgot him, brought him his food. Jeanne took him up in her arms, kissed him, and carried him into the house. He could hardly creep along, his legs were so stiff, and he barked like a child's wooden toy dog. At length the last day dawned. Jeanne had passed the night in Julien's old room, as all the furniture had been moved out of hers, and when she rose she felt as tired and exhausted as if she had been running a long distance. In the courtyard stood the gig in which Rosalie and her mistress were to go, and a cart on which the remainder of the furniture and the trunks were already loaded. Ludivine and old Simon were to stay at the chateau until its new owner arrived, and then, too old to stay in service any longer, they were going to their friends to live on their savings and the pensions Jeanne had given them. Marius had married and left the chateau long ago. About 8 o'clock a fine, cold rain, which the wind drove in slanting lines, began to fall, and the furniture on the cart had to be covered over with tarpaulins. Some steaming cups of coffee stood on the kitchen table, and Jeanne sat down and slowly drank hers up, then rising, "Let us go," she said. She began to put on her hat and shawl, while Rosalie put on her goloshes. A great lump rose in her throat, and she whispered: "Rosalie, do you remember how it rained the day we left Rouen to come here?" She broke off abruptly, pressed her hands to her heart, and fell backwards in a sort of fit. For more than an hour she lay as if she were dead. Then, when she at length recovered consciousness, she went into violent hysterics. Gradually she became calmer, but this attack had left her so weak that she could not rise to her feet. Rosalie, fearing another attack if they did not get her away at once, went for her son, and between them they carried her to the gig and placed her on the leather-covered seat. Rosalie got up beside her, wrapped up her legs, threw a thick cloak over her shoulders, then, opening an umbrella over her head, cried: "Make haste, and let's get off, Denis." The young man climbed up by his mother, sat down with one leg right outside the gig for want of room, and started off his horse at a quick jerky trot, which shook the two women from side to side. As they turned the corner of the village they saw someone walking up and down the road. It was the Abbé Tolbiac, apparently waiting to see their departure. He was holding up his cassock with one hand to keep it out of the wet, regardless of showing his thin legs, which were encased in black stockings, and his huge muddy boots. When he saw the carriage coming he stopped, and stood on one side to let it pass. Jeanne looked down to avoid meeting his eyes, while Rosalie, who had heard all about him, furiously muttered: "You brute! You brute!" and seizing her son's hand: "Give him a cut with the whip," she exclaimed. The young man did not do that, but he urged on his horse, and then, just as they were passing the Abbé, suddenly let the wheel of the gig drop into a deep rut. There was a splash, and in an instant the priest was covered with mud from head to foot. Rosalie laughed all over her face, and turning round she shook her fist at the Abbé, as he stood wiping himself down with his big handkerchief. "Oh, we have forgotten massacre!" suddenly cried Jeanne. Denis pulled up, gave Rosalie the reins to hold, and jumped down to run and fetch the dog. Then in a few minutes he came back with the big shapeless animal in his arms, and placed him in the gig between the two women. Chapter 13 of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. Chapter 13. After a 2 hours' drive, the gig drew up before a little brick house, standing by the high road in the middle of an orchard planted with pear trees. 4 lattice-work arbours, covered with honeysuckle and clematis, stood at the 4 corners of the garden, which was planted with vegetables, and laid out in little beds with narrow paths bordered with fruit trees running between them. And both garden and orchard were entirely surrounded by a thick-set hedge, which divided them from a field belonging to the next farm. About 30 yards lower down the road was a forge, and that was the only dwelling within a mile. All around lay fields and plains, with farms scattered here and there, half hidden by the 4 double rows of big trees which surrounded them. Jeanne wanted to rest as soon as they arrived, but Rosalie, wishing to keep her from thinking, would not let her do so. The carpenter from Goderville had come to help them put the place in order, and they all began to arrange the furniture which was already there, without waiting for the last cartload which was coming on. The arrangement of the rooms took a long time, for everyone's ideas and opinions had to be consulted, and then the cart from Les Peuples arrived and had to be unloaded in the rain. When night fell, the house was in a state of utter disorder, and all the rooms were full of things piled anyhow, one on top of the other. Jeanne was tired out and fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. The next few days there was so much to do that she had no time to fret. In fact, she even found a certain pleasure in making her new home pretty, for all the time she was working she thought that her son would one day come and live there. The tapestry from her bedroom at Les Peuples was hung in the dining room, which was also to serve as drawing room, and Jeanne took especial pains over the arrangement of one of the rooms on the first floor, which in her own mind she had already named Poulet's room. She was to have the other one on that floor, and Rosalie was to sleep upstairs next to the box room. The little house thus tastefully arranged looked pretty when it was all finished, and at first Jeanne was pleased with it, though she was haunted by the feeling that there was something missing, though she could not tell what. One morning a clerk came over from the attorney at Fécamp with the 3,600 francs, the price at which an upholsterer had valued the furniture left at Les Peuples. Jeanne felt a thrill of pleasure as she took the money, for she had not expected to get so much, and as soon as the man had gone, she put on her hat and hurried off to Goderville to send Paul this unlooked-for sum as quickly as possible. But as she was hastening along the road, she met Rosalie coming back from market. The maid suspected that something had happened, though she did not at once guess the truth. She soon found it out, however, for Jeanne could not hide anything from her, and placing her basket on the ground to give way to her wrath at her ease, she put her hands on her hips and scolded Jeanne at the top of her voice. Then she took hold of her mistress with her right hand and her basket with her left, and walked on again towards the house in a great passion. As soon as they were indoors, Rosalie ordered the money to be given into her care, and Jeanne gave it her, with the exception of 600 francs which she said nothing about. But this trick was soon detected, and Jeanne had to give it all up. However, Rosalie consented to these odd hundreds being sent to the young man, who in a few days wrote to thank his mother for the money. "It was a most welcome present, mother dear," he said, "for we were reduced to utter want." Time went on, but Jeanne could not get accustomed to her new home. It seemed as if she could not breathe freely at Batteville, and she felt more alone and forsaken than ever. She would often walk as far as the village of Verneuil, and come back through Trois Mers, but as soon as she was home, she started up to go out again, as if she had forgotten to go to the very place to which she had meant to walk. The same thing happened time after time, and she could not understand where it was she longed to go. One evening, however, she unconsciously uttered a sentence which at once revealed to her the secret of her restlessness. "Oh, how I long to see the ocean!" she said as she sat down to dinner. The sea, that was what she missed. The sea with its salt breezes, its never-ceasing roar, its tempests, its strong odours. The sea near which she had lived for 25 years, which had always felt near her, and which, unconsciously, she had come to love like a human being. Massacre, too, was very uneasy. The very evening of his arrival at the new house, he had installed himself under the kitchen dresser, and no one could get him to move out. There he lay all day long, never stirring except to turn himself over with a smothered grunt, until it was dark. Then he got up and dragged himself towards the garden door, grazing himself against the wall as he went. After he had stayed out of doors a few minutes, he came in again and sat down before the stove, which was still warm, and as soon as Jeanne and Rosalie had gone to bed, he began to howl. The whole night long he howled, in a pitiful, deplorable way, sometimes ceasing for an hour, only to recommence in a still more doleful tone. A barrel was put outside the house and he was tied up to it, but he howled just the same out of doors as in, and as he was old and almost dying, he was brought back to the kitchen again. It was impossible for Jeanne to sleep. For the whole night she could hear the old dog moaning and scratching as he tried to get used to this new house, which he found so different from his old home. Nothing would quiet him. His eyes were dim, and it seemed as if the knowledge of his infirmity made him keep still while everyone else was awake and downstairs, and at night he wandered restlessly about until daybreak, as if he only dared to move in the darkness which makes all things sightless for the time. It was an intense relief to everyone when one morning he was found dead. Winter wore on, and Jeanne gave way more and more to an insuperable loneliness. It was no longer a keen, heart-rending grief that she felt, but a dull, gloomy melancholy. There was nothing to rouse her from it, no one came to see her, and the road which passed before her door was almost deserted. Sometimes a gig passed by, driven by a red-faced man whose blouse, blown out by the wind, looked like a blue balloon, and sometimes a cart crawled past, or a peasant and his wife could be seen coming from the distance, growing larger and larger as they approached the house, and then diminishing again when they had passed it, till they looked like two insects at the end of the long white line which stretched as far as the eye could reach, rising and falling with the undulation of the earth. When the grass again sprang up, a little girl passed the gate every morning with 2 thin cows which browsed along the side of the road, and in the evening she returned, taking, as in the morning, one step every 10 minutes as she followed the animals. Every night Jeanne dreamt she was again at Les Peuples. She thought she was there with her father and mother and Aunt Lison as in the old times. Again she accomplished the old forgotten duties, and supported Madame Adelaide as she walked in her avenue, and each time she awoke she burst into tears. Paul was continually in her thoughts, and she wondered what he was doing, if he were well, and if he ever thought of her. She revolved all these painful thoughts in her mind as she walked along the low-lying roads between the farms, and what was more torture to her than anything else was the fierce jealousy of the woman who had deprived her of her son. It was this hatred alone which restrained her from taking any steps towards finding Paul and trying to see him. She could imagine her son's mistress confronting her at the door and asking, "What is your business here, madame?" And her self-respect would not permit her to run the risk of such an encounter. In the haughty pride of a chaste and spotless woman, who had never stooped to listen to temptation, she became still more bitter against the base and cowardly actions to which sensual love will drive a man who is not strong enough to throw off its degrading chains. The whole of humanity seemed to her unclean as she thought of the obscene secrets of the senses, of the caresses which debase as they are given and received, and of all the mysteries which surround the attraction of the sexes. Another spring and summer passed away, and when the autumn came again with its rainy days, its dull grey skies, its heavy clouds, Jeanne felt so weary of the life she was leading that she determined to make a supreme attempt to regain possession of her poulet. Surely the young man's passion must have cooled by this time, and she wrote him a touching, pitiful letter. My dear child, I am coming to entreat you to return to me. Think how I am left, lonely, aged and ill, the whole year with only a servant. I am living now in a little house by the roadside, and it is very miserable for me. But if you were here, everything would seem different. You are all I have in the world, and I have not seen you for 7 years. You will never know how unhappy I have been, and how my every thought was centred in you. You were my life, my soul, my only hope, my only love, and you are away from me. You have forsaken me. Oh, come back, my darling poulet. Come back and let me hold you in my arms again. Come back to your old mother, who so longs to see you. Jeanne. A few days later came the following reply: My dear mother, I should only be too glad to come and see you, but I have not a penny. Send me some money and I will come. I had myself been thinking of coming to speak to you about a plan which, if carried out, would permit me to do as you desire. I shall never be able to repay the disinterested affection of the woman who has shared all my troubles, but I can at least make a public recognition of her faithful love and devotion. Her behaviour is all you could desire. She is well educated and well read, and you cannot imagine what a comfort she has been to me. I should be a brute if I did not make her some recompense, and I ask your permission to marry her. Then we could all live together in your new house, and you would forgive my follies. I am convinced that you would give your consent at once if you knew her. I assure you she is very ladylike and quiet, and I know you would like her. As for me, I could not live without her. I shall await your reply with every impatience, dear mother. We both send you much love. Your son, Vicomte Paul de la Mare. Jeanne was thunderstruck. As she sat with the letter on her knees, she could see so plainly through the designs of this woman who had not once let Paul return to his friends, but had always kept him at her side while she patiently waited until his mother should give in and consent to anything and everything in the irresistible desire of having her son with her again. And it was with bitter pain that she thought of how Paul obstinately persisted in preferring this creature to herself. "He does not love me, he does not love me," she murmured over and over again. "He wants to marry her now," she said when Rosalie came in. The servant started. "Oh, madame, you surely will not consent to it. Monsieur Paul can't bring that hussy here." All the pride in Jeanne's nature rose in revolt at the thought, and though she was bowed down with grief, she replied decidedly: "No, Rosalie, never. But since he won't come here, I will go to him, and we will see which of us two will have the greater influence over him." She wrote to Paul at once, telling him that she was coming to Paris, and would see him anywhere but at the house where he was living with that wretch. Then, while she awaited his reply, she began to make all her preparations for the journey, and Rosalie commenced to pack her mistress's linen and clothes in an old trunk. "You haven't a single thing to put on," exclaimed the servant, as she was folding up an old, badly made dress. "I won't have you go with such clothes. You'd be a disgrace to everyone, and the Paris ladies would think you were a servant." Jeanne let her have her own way, and they both went to Goderville and chose some green checked stuff which they left with the dressmaker to be made up. Then they went to see M. Roussel, the lawyer, who went to Paris for a fortnight every year to obtain a few directions, for it was 28 years since Jeanne had been to the capital. He gave them a great deal of advice about crossing the roads and the way to avoid being robbed, saying that the safest plan was to carry only just as much money as was necessary in the pockets, and to sew the rest in the lining of the dress. Then he talked for a long time about the restaurants where the charges were moderate, and mentioned 2 or 3 to which ladies could go, and he recommended Jeanne to stay at the Hôtel de Normandie, which was near the railway station. He always stayed there himself, and she could say he had sent her. There had been a railway between Paris and Havre for the last 6 years, but Jeanne had never seen one of these steam engines, of which everyone was talking, and which were revolutionising the whole country. The days passed on, but still there came no answer from Paul. Every morning for a fortnight Jeanne had gone along the road to meet the postman and had asked, in a voice which she could not keep steady, "You have nothing for me to day, Père Malandin?" And the answer was always the same, "No, nothing yet, ma bonne dame." Fully persuaded that it was that woman who was preventing Paul from answering, Jeanne determined not to wait any longer, but to start at once. She wanted to take Rosalie with her, but the maid would not go because of increasing the expense of the journey, and she only allowed her mistress to take 300 francs with her. "If you want any more money," she said, "write to me, and I'll tell the lawyer to forward you some. But if I give you any more now, Monsieur Paul will have it all." Then one December morning, Denis Lecoq's gig came to take them both to the railway station, for Rosalie was going to accompany her mistress as far as that. When they reached the station, they found out first how much the tickets were, then, when the trunk had been labelled and the ticket bought, they stood watching the rails, both too much occupied in wondering what the train would be like to think of the sad cause of this journey. At last a distant whistle made them look round, and they saw a large black machine approaching, which came up with a terrible noise, dragging after it a long chain of little rolling houses. A porter opened the door of one of these little huts, and Jeanne kissed Rosalie and got in. "Au revoir, madame. I hope you'll have a pleasant journey and will soon be back again. Au revoir, Rosalie." There was another whistle, and the string of carriages moved slowly off, gradually going faster and faster, till they reached a terrific speed. In Jeanne's compartment there were only 2 other passengers, who were both asleep, and she sat and watched the fields and farms and villages rush past. She was frightened at the speed at which she was going, and the feeling came over her that she was entering a new phase of life, and was being hurried towards a very different world from that in which she had spent her peaceful girlhood and her monotonous life. It was evening when she reached Paris. A porter took her trunk, and she followed closely at his heels, sometimes almost running for fear of losing sight of him, and feeling frightened as she was pushed about by the swaying crowd through which she did not know how to pass. "I was recommended here by Monsieur Roussel," she hastened to say when she was in the hotel office. The landlady, a big, stolid-looking woman, was sitting at the desk. "Who is Monsieur Roussel?" she asked. "The lawyer from Goderville, who stays here every year," replied Jeanne in surprise. "Very likely he does," responded the big woman, "but I don't know him. Do you want a room?" "Yes, madame." A waiter shouldered the luggage and led the way upstairs. Jeanne followed, feeling very low-spirited and depressed, and sitting down at a little table, she ordered some soup and the wing of a chicken to be sent up to her, for she had had nothing to eat since daybreak. She thought of how she had passed through this same town on her return from her wedding tour, as she ate her supper by the miserable light of one candle, and of how Julien had then first shown himself in his true character. But then she was young and brave and hopeful. Now she felt old and timid, and the least thing worried and frightened her. When she had finished her supper, she went to the window and watched the crowded street. She would have liked to go out if she had dared, but she thought she should be sure to lose herself, so she went to bed. But she had hardly yet got over the bustle of the journey, and that and the noise and the sensation of being in a strange place kept her awake. The hours passed on, and the noises outside gradually ceased, but still she could not sleep, for she was accustomed to the sound, peaceful sleep of the country, which is so different from the semi-repose of a great city. Here she was conscious of a sort of restlessness all around her. The murmur of voices reached her ears, and every now and then a board creaked, a door shut, or a bell rang. She was just dozing off about 2 o'clock in the morning, when a woman suddenly began to scream in a neighbouring room. Jeanne started up in bed, and next she thought she heard a man laughing. As dawn approached she became more and more anxious to see Paul, and as soon as it was light she got up and dressed. He lived in the Rue du Sauvage, and she meant to follow Rosalie's advice about spending as little as possible and walk there. It was a fine day, though the wind was keen, and there were a great many people hurrying along the pavements. Jeanne walked along the street as quickly as she could. When she reached the other end she was to turn to the right, then to the left. Then she would come to a square where she was to ask again. She could not find the square, and a baker from whom she inquired the way gave her different directions altogether. She started on again, missed the way, wandered about, and in trying to follow other directions, lost herself entirely. She walked on and was just going to hail a cab when she saw the Seine. Then she decided to walk along the quays, and in about an hour she reached the dark, dirty lane called Rue du Sauvage. When she came to the number she was seeking, she was so excited that she stood before the door unable to move another step. Poulet was there, in that house. Her hands and knees trembled violently, and it was some moments before she could enter and walk along the passage to the doorkeeper's box. "Will you go and tell Monsieur Paul de Lamare that an old lady friend of his mother's is waiting to see him?" she said, slipping a piece of money into the man's hand. "He does not live here now, madame," answered the doorkeeper. She started. "Oh, where is he living now?" she gasped. "I do not know." She felt stunned, and it was some time before she could speak again. "When did he leave?" she asked at last, controlling herself by a violent effort. The man was quite ready to tell her all he knew. "About a fortnight ago," he replied. "They just walked out of the house one evening and didn't come back. They owed all over the neighbourhood, so you may guess they didn't leave an address." Tongues of flame were dancing before Jeanne's eyes, as if a gun were being fired off close to her face, but she wanted to find Poulet, and that kept her up and made her stand opposite the doorkeeper, as if she were calmly thinking. "Then he did not say anything when he left?" "No, nothing at all. They went away to get out of paying their debts." "But he will have to send for his letters." "He'll send a good many times before he gets them, then. Besides, they didn't have 10 in a 12-month, though I took them up 2 days before they left." That must have been the one she sent. "Listen," she said hastily. "I am his mother, and I have come to look for him. Here are 10 francs for yourself. If you hear anything from or about him, let me know at once, at the Hôtel de Normandie, Rue de Havre, and you shall be well paid for your trouble." "You may depend upon me, madame," answered the doorkeeper, and Jeanne went away. She hastened along the streets as if she were bent on an important mission, but she was not looking or caring whither she was going. She walked close to the walls, pushed and buffeted by errand boys and porters, crossed the roads regardless of the vehicles and the shouts of the drivers, stumbled against the curbstones which she did not see, and hurried on, unconscious of everything and every one. At last she found herself in some gardens, and feeling too weak to walk any further, she dropped on a seat. She sat there a long while, apparently unaware that the tears were running down her cheeks, and that passers-by stopped to look at her. At last the bitter cold made her rise to go, but her legs would hardly carry her, so weak and exhausted was she. She would have liked some soup, but she dared not go into a restaurant, for she knew people could see she was in trouble, and it made her feel timid and ashamed. When she passed an eating place she would stop a moment at the door, look inside, and see all the people sitting at the tables eating, and then go on again, saying to herself, I will go into the next one. But when she came to the next, her courage always failed her again. In the end she went into a baker's shop and bought a little crescent-shaped roll, which she ate as she went along. She was very thirsty, but she did not know where to get anything to drink, so she went without. She passed under an arch and found herself in some more gardens with arcades running all round them, and she recognised the Palais Royal. Her walk in the sun had made her warm again, so she sat down for another hour or two. A crowd of people flowed into the gardens, an elegant crowd composed of beautiful women and wealthy men, who only lived for dress and pleasure, and who chatted and smiled and bowed as they sauntered along. Feeling ill at ease amidst this brilliant throng, Jeanne rose to go away, but suddenly the thought struck her that perhaps she might meet Paul here, and she began to walk from end to end of the gardens with hasty, furtive steps, carefully scanning every face she met. Soon she saw that people turned to look and laugh at her, and she hurried away, thinking it was her odd appearance and her green check dress, which Rosalie had chosen and had made up, that attracted everyone's attention and smiles. She hardly dared ask her way, but she did at last venture, and when she had reached her hotel, she passed the rest of the day sitting on a chair at the foot of the bed. In the evening she dined off some soup and a little meat, like the day before, and then undressed and went to bed, performing all the duties of her toilet quite mechanically, from sheer habit. The next morning she went to the police office to see if she could get any help there towards the discovery of her son's whereabouts. They told her they could not promise her anything, but that they would attend to the matter. After she had left the police office, she wandered about the streets in the hopes of meeting her child, and she felt more friendless and forsaken among the busy crowds than she did in the midst of the lovely fields. When she returned to the hotel in the evening, she was told that a man from M. Paul had asked for her, and was coming again the next day. All the blood in her body seemed to suddenly rush to her heart, and she could not close her eyes all night. Perhaps it was Paul himself. Yes, it must be so, although his appearance did not tally with the description the hotel people had given of the man who had called. And when, about 9 o'clock in the morning, there came a knock at the door, she cried, "Come in," expecting her son to rush into her arms held open to receive him. But it was a stranger who entered, a stranger who began to apologize for disturbing her, and to explain that he had come about some money Paul owed him. As he spoke, she felt herself beginning to cry, and she tried to hide her tears from the man by wiping them away with the end of her finger as soon as they reached the corners of her eyes. The man had heard of her arrival from the concierge at the Rue du Sauvage, and as he could not find Paul, he had come to his mother. He held out a paper which Jeanne mechanically took. She saw 90 francs written on it, and she drew out the money and paid the man. She did not go out at all that day, and the next morning more creditors appeared. She gave them all the money she had left, except 20 francs, and wrote and told Rosalie how she was placed. Until her servant's answer came, she passed the days in wandering aimlessly about the streets. She did not know what to do or how to kill the long, miserable hours. There was no one who knew of her troubles, or to whom she could go for sympathy, and her one desire was to get away from this city and to return to her little house beside the lonely road, where, a few days before, she had felt she could not bear to live because it was so dull and lonely. Now she was sure she could live nowhere else but in that little home, where all her mournful habits had taken root. At last, one evening, she found a letter from Rosalie, awaiting her with 200 francs enclosed. "Come back as soon as possible, Madame Jeanne," wrote the maid, "for I shall send you nothing more. As for M. Paul, I will go and fetch him myself the next time we hear anything from him. With best respects, your servant, Rosalie." And Jeanne started back to Batteville one bitterly cold, snowy morning. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Lisa Reichert. After her return from Paris, Jeanne would not go out or take any interest in anything. She rose at the same hour every morning, looked out of the window to see what sort of day it was, then went downstairs and sat before the fire in the dining room. She stayed there the whole day, sitting perfectly still with her eyes fixed on the flames, while she thought of all the sorrows she had passed through. The little room grew darker and darker, but she never moved, except to put more wood on the fire, and when Rosalie brought in the lamp she cried: "Come, Madame Jeanne, you must stir about a bit, or you won't be able to eat any dinner again this evening." Often she was worried by thoughts which she could not dismiss from her mind, and she allowed herself to be tormented by the veriest trifles, for the most insignificant matters appeared of the greatest importance to her diseased mind. She lived in the memories of the past, and she would think for hours together of her girlhood and her wedding tour in Corsica. The wild scenery that she had long forgotten suddenly appeared before her in the fire, and she could recall every detail, every event, every face connected with the island. She could always see the features of Jean Ravoli, the guide, and sometimes she fancied she could even hear his voice. At other times she thought of the peaceful years of Paul's childhood, of how he used to make her tend the salad plants, and of how she and Aunt Lison used to kneel on the ground, each trying to outdo the other in giving pleasure to the boy, and in rearing the greater number of plants. Her lips would form the words, "Poulet, my little Poulet," as if she were talking to him, and she would cease to muse and try for hours to write in the air the letters which formed her son's name, with her outstretched finger. Slowly she traced them before the fire, fancying she could see them, and thinking she had made a mistake, she began the word over and over again, forcing herself to write the whole name, though her arm trembled with fatigue. At last she would become so nervous that she mixed up the letters and formed other words, and had to give it up. She had all the manias and fancies which beset those who lead a solitary life, and it irritated her to the last degree to see the slightest change in the arrangement of the furniture. Rosalie often made her go out with her along the road, but after 20 minutes or so Jeanne would say, "I cannot walk any further, Rosalie," and would sit down by the roadside. Soon movement of any kind became distasteful to her, and she stayed in bed as late as she could. Ever since a child she had always been in the habit of jumping out of bed as soon as she had drunk her café au lait. She was particularly fond of her morning coffee, and she would have missed it more than anything. She always waited for Rosalie to bring it with an impatience that had a touch of sensuality in it, and as soon as the cup was placed on the bedside table she sat up and emptied it somewhat greedily. Then she at once threw back the bedclothes and began to dress. But gradually she fell into the habit of dreaming for a few moments after she had placed her empty cup back in the saucer, and from that she soon began to lie down again, and at last she stayed in bed every day until Rosalie came back in a temper and dressed her almost by force. She had no longer the slightest will of her own. Whenever her servant asked her advice, or put any question to her, or wanted to know her opinion, she always answered, "Do as you like, Rosalie." So firmly did she believe herself pursued by a persistent ill luck that she became as great a fatalist as an Oriental, and she was so accustomed to seeing her dreams unfulfilled and her hopes disappointed that she did not dare undertake anything fresh, and hesitated for days before she commenced the simplest task, so persuaded was she that whatever she touched would be sure to go wrong. "I don't think anyone could have had more misfortune than I have had all my life," she was always saying. "How would it be if you had to work for your bread, and if you were obliged to get up every morning at 6 o'clock to go and do a hard day's work?" Rosalie would exclaim. "That's what a great many people have to do, and then when they get too old to work, they die of want." "But my son has forsaken me, and I am all alone," Jeanne would reply. That enraged Rosalie. "And what if he has? What about those whose children enlist or settle in America?" America, in her eyes, was a shadowy country whither people went to make their fortune, and whence they never returned. "Children always leave their parents sooner or later. Old and young people aren't meant to stay together." "And then what if he were dead?" she would finish up with savagely, and her mistress could say nothing after that. Jeanne got a little stronger when the first warm days of spring came, but she only took advantage of her better health to bury herself still deeper in her gloomy thoughts. She went up to the garret one morning to look for something, and while she was there happened to open a box full of old almanacs. It seemed as if she had found the past years themselves, and she was filled with emotion as she looked at the pile of cards. They were of all sizes, big and little, and she took them every one down to the dining room and began to lay them out on the table in the right order of years. Suddenly she picked up the very first one, the one she had taken with her from the convent to Les Peuples. For a long time she gazed at it with its dates, which she had crossed out the day she had left Rouen, and she began to shed slow, bitter tears, the weak, pitiful tears of an aged woman, as she looked at these cards spread out before her on the table, and which represented all her wretched life. Then the thought struck her that by means of these almanacs she could recall all that she had ever done, and giving way to the idea, she at once devoted herself to the task of retracing the past. She pinned all the cards, which had grown yellow with age, up on the tapestry, and then passed hours before one or other of them, thinking, "What did I do in that month?" She had put a mark beside all the important dates in her life, and sometimes, by means of linking together and adding one to the other all the little circumstances which had preceded and followed a great event, she succeeded in remembering a whole month. By dint of concentrated attention, and efforts of will and of memory, she retraced nearly the whole of her first 2 years at Les Peuples, recalling without much difficulty this far-away period of her life, for it seemed to stand out in relief. But the following years were shrouded in a sort of mist, and seemed to run one into the other, and sometimes she pored over an almanac for hours without being able to remember whether it was even in that year that such and such a thing had happened. She would go slowly round the dining room, looking at these images of past years, which to her were as pictures of an ascent to Calvary, until one of them arrested her attention, and then she would sit gazing at it all the rest of the day, absorbed in her recollections. Soon the sap began to rise in the trees. The seeds were springing up, the leaves were budding, and the air was filled with the faint sweet smell of the apple blossoms, which made the orchards a glowing mass of pink. As summer approached, Jeanne became rather restless. She could not keep still. She went in and out 20 times a day, and as she rambled along past the farms, she worked herself into a perfect state of fever. A daisy half hidden in the grass, a sunbeam falling through the leaves, or the reflection of the sky in a splash of water in a rut, was enough to agitate and affect her, for their sight brought back a kind of echo of the emotions she had felt when, as a young girl, she had wandered dreamily through the fields. And though now there was nothing to which she could look forward, the soft yet exhilarating air sent the same thrill through her as when all her life had lain before her. But this pleasure was not unalloyed with pain, and it seemed as if the universal joy of the awakening world could now only impart a delight which was half sorrow to her grief-crushed soul and withered heart. Everything around her seemed to have changed. Surely the sun was hardly so warm as in her youth, the sky so deep a blue, the grass so fresh a green, and the flowers, paler and less sweet, could no longer arouse within her the exquisite ecstasies of delight as of old. Still she could enjoy the beauty around her, so much that sometimes she found herself dreaming and hoping again, for however cruel fate may be, is it possible to give way to utter despair when the sun shines and the sky is blue? She went for long walks, urged on and on by her inward excitement, and sometimes she would suddenly stop and sit down by the roadside to think of her troubles. Why had she not been loved like other women? Why had even the simple pleasure of an uneventful existence been refused her? Sometimes, again forgetting for a moment that she was old, that there was no longer any pleasure in store for her, and that, with the exception of a few more lonely years, her life was over and done, she would build all sorts of castles in the air, and make plans for such a happy future, just as she had done when she was 16. Then, suddenly remembering the bitter reality, she would get up again, feeling as if a heavy load had fallen upon her, and return home, murmuring, "Oh, you old fool, you old fool!" Now Rosalie was always saying to her, "Do keep still, madame. What on earth makes you want to run about so?" "I can't help it," Jeanne would reply sadly. I am like Massacre was before he died." One morning Rosalie went into her mistress's room earlier than usual. " Make haste and drink up your coffee," she said, as she placed the cup on the table. " Denis is waiting to take us to Les Peuples. I have to go over there on business." Jeanne was so excited that she thought she would have fainted, and as she dressed herself with trembling fingers she could hardly believe she was going to see her dear home once more. Overhead was a bright blue sky, and as they went along Denis's pony would every now and then break into a gallop. When they reached Etouvent, Jeanne could hardly breathe, her heart beat so quickly, and when she saw the brick pillars beside the chateau gate she exclaimed, " Oh !" 2 or 3 times in a low voice, as if she were in the presence of something which stirred her very soul, and she could not help herself. They put up the horse at the Couillards' farm, and when Rosalie and her son went to attend to their business, the farmer asked Jeanne if she would like to go over the chateau, as the owner was away, and gave her the key. She went off alone, and when she found herself opposite the old manor she stood still to look at it. The outside had not been touched since she had left. All the shutters were closed, and the sunbeams were dancing on the grey walls of the big, weather beaten building. A little piece of wood fell on her dress. She looked up and saw that it had fallen from the plane tree, and she went up to the big tree and stroked its pale, smooth bark as if it had been alive. Her foot touched a piece of rotten wood lying in the grass. It was the last fragment of the seat on which she had so often sat with her loved ones, the seat which had been put up the very day of Julien's first visit to the chateau. Then she went to the hall door. She had some difficulty in opening it, as the key was rusty and would not turn, but at last the lock gave way and the door itself only required a slight push before it swung back. The first thing Jeanne did was to run up to her own room. It had been hung with a light paper, and she hardly knew it again, but when she opened one of the windows and looked out, she was moved almost to tears as she saw again the scene she loved so well, the thicket, the elms, the common, and the sea covered with brown sails which, at this distance, looked as if they were motionless. Then she went all over the big empty house. She stopped to look at a little hole in the plaster which the baron had made with his cane, for he used to make a few thrusts at the wall whenever he passed this spot, in memory of the fencing bouts he had had in his youth. In her mother's bedroom she found a small gold-headed pin stuck in the wall behind the door, in a dark corner near the bed. She had stuck it there a long while ago, she remembered it now, and had looked everywhere for it since, but it had never been found, and she kissed it and took it with her as a priceless relic. She went into every room, recognising the almost invisible spots and marks on the hangings which had not been changed, and again noting the odd forms and faces which the imagination so often traces in the designs of the furniture coverings, the coverings of mantelpieces, and the shadows on soiled ceilings. She walked through the vast silent chateau as noiselessly as if she were in a cemetery. All her life was interred there. She went down to the drawing room. The closed shutters made it very dark, and it was a few moments before she could distinguish anything. Then, as her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, she gradually made out the tapestry with the big white birds on it. 2 armchairs stood before the fireplace, looking as if they had just been vacated, and the very smell of the room, a smell that had always been peculiar to it, as each human being has his, a smell which could be perceived at once, and yet was vague like all the faint perfumes of old rooms, brought the memories crowding to Jeanne's mind. Her breath came quickly as she stood with her eyes fixed on the 2 chairs, inhaling this perfume of the past, and all at once, in a sudden hallucination occasioned by her thoughts, she fancied she did see her father and mother with their feet on the fender, as she had so often seen them before. She drew back in terror, stumbling against the door frame, and clung to it for support, still keeping her eyes fixed on the armchairs. The vision disappeared, and for some minutes she stood horror stricken. Then she slowly regained possession of herself and turned to fly, afraid that she was going mad. Her eyes fell on the wainscoting against which she was leaning, and she saw Poulet's ladder. There were all the faint marks traced on the wall at unequal intervals, and the figures which had been cut with a penknife to indicate the month, and the child's age and growth. In some places there was the baron's big writing, in others her own, in others again Aunt Lison's, which was a little shaky. She could see the boy standing there now, with his fair hair and his little forehead pressed against the wall to have his height measured, while the baron exclaimed, "Jeanne, he has grown half an inch in 6 weeks." And she began to kiss the wainscoting in a frenzy of love for the very wood. Then she heard Rosalie's voice outside calling, "Madame Jeanne, Madame Jeanne, lunch is waiting," and she went out with her head in a whirl. She felt unable to understand anything that was said to her. She ate what was placed before her, listening to what was being said without realising the sense of the words, answering the farmers' wives when they inquired after her health, passively received their kisses and kissed the cheeks which were offered to her, and then got into the chaise again. When she could no longer see the high roof of the chateau through the trees, something within her seemed to break, and she felt that she had just said good-bye to her old home for ever. They went straight back to Batteville, and as she was going indoors, Jeanne saw something white under the door. It was a letter which the postman had slipped there during their absence. She at once recognised Paul's handwriting, and tore open the envelope in an agony of anxiety. He wrote: "My dear mother, I have not written before because I did not want to bring you to Paris on a fruitless errand, for I have always been meaning to come and see you myself. At the present moment I am in great trouble and difficulty. My wife gave birth to a little girl 3 days ago, and now she is dying and I have not a penny. I do not know what to do with the child. The doorkeeper is trying to nourish it with a feeding bottle as best she can, but I fear I shall lose it. Could not you take it? I cannot send it to a wet nurse as I have not any money, and I do not know which way to turn. Pray answer by return post. Your loving son, Paul." Jeanne dropped on a chair with hardly enough strength left to call Rosalie. The maid came and they read the letter over again together, and then sat looking at each other in silence. "I'll go and fetch the child myself, madame," said Rosalie at last. "We can't leave it to die." "Very well, my girl, go," answered Jeanne. "Put on your hat, madame," said the maid after a pause, "and we will go and see the lawyer at Goderville. If that woman is going to die, Monsieur Paul must marry her for the sake of the child." Jeanne put on her hat without a word. Her heart was overflowing with joy, but she would not have allowed anyone to see it for the world, for it was one of those detestable joys in which people can revel in their hearts, but of which they are all the same ashamed. Her son's mistress was going to die. The lawyer gave Rosalie detailed instructions, which the servant made him repeat 2 or 3 times. Then, when she was sure she knew exactly what to do, she said, "Don't you fear, I'll see it's all right now," and she started for Paris that very night. Jeanne passed 2 days in such an agony of mind that she could fix her thoughts on nothing. The 3rd morning she received a line from Rosalie, merely saying she was coming back by that evening's train, nothing more. In the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, Jeanne sent round to a neighbour to ask him if he would drive her to the Beuzeville railway station to meet her servant. She stood on the platform looking down the rails, which seemed to get closer together right away as far off as she could see, and turning every now and then to look at the clock. 10 minutes more, 5 minutes, 2, and at last the train was due, though as yet she could see no signs of it. Then all at once she saw a cloud of white smoke, and underneath it a black speck which got rapidly larger and larger. The big engine came into the station snorting and slackening its speed, and Jeanne looked eagerly into every window as the carriages went past her. The doors opened and several people got out, peasants in blouses, farmers' wives with baskets on their arms, a few bourgeois in soft hats, and at last Rosalie appeared, carrying what looked like a bundle of linen in her arms. Jeanne would have stepped forward to meet her, but all her strength seemed to have left her legs, and she feared she would fall if she moved. The maid saw her and came up in her ordinary calm way. "Good day, madame. Here I am again, though I've had some bother to get along." "Well?" gasped Jeanne. "Well," answered Rosalie, "she died last night. They were married, and here's the baby. and she held out the child, which could not be seen for its wraps. Jeanne mechanically took it, and they left the station and got into the carriage which was waiting. "Monsieur Paul is coming directly after the funeral. I suppose he'll be here to morrow by this train." "Paul," murmured Jeanne, and then stopped without saying anything more. The sun was sinking towards the horizon, bathing in a glow of light the green fields which were flecked here and there with golden colewort flowers or blood red poppies, and over the quiet country fell an infinite peace. The peasant who was driving the chaise kept clicking his tongue to urge on his horse, which trotted swiftly along, and Jeanne looked straight up into the sky, which the circling flight of the swallows seemed to cut asunder. All at once she became conscious of a soft warmth which was making itself felt through her skirts. It was the heat from the tiny being sleeping on her knees, and it moved her strangely. She suddenly drew back the covering from the child she had not yet seen, that she might look at her son's daughter. As the light fell on its face the little creature opened its blue eyes and moved its lips, and then Jeanne hugged it closely to her, and raising it in her arms, began to cover it with passionate kisses. "Come, come, Madame Jeanne, have done," said Rosalie in sharp though good-tempered tones. "You'll make the child cry." Then she added, as if in reply to her own thoughts, "After all, life is never so jolly or so miserable as people seem to think." End of chapter 14. End of A Woman's Life by Guy de Maupassant.